Hello, SPED 2010 students. I hope everyone had a great week last week. We finished out doing our autism spectrum disorder module, so hopefully you were able to gain some more knowledge. I don't know if you were familiar with autism spectrum disorder, but if not, hopefully this gave you some knowledge. I think that it's important for us as educators, even if you're not working in a special education setting and you are in an inclusive classroom, to be able to have the experience with understanding the disability, understanding the implications, understanding the behavioral and social characteristics of a certain disability, as well as educational considerations and how you can support that child in the classroom. Chapter 9 in Exceptional Learners textbook had a lot of great information, so hopefully you were able to use that and implement that knowledge moving forward. So shifting gears, this week we're going to be working in our last week, our last chapter, if you will, of Module 3, which means that starting on November 6th, we will have our new module and we will be taking our second test in this course. So as I mentioned before, we only have 3 tests in this course. So this one is going to be specifically over Module 3, weeks 6 through 10. So we're finishing out. This is our last week before our test. I have provided you with a study guide as well as a PowerPoint review guide that goes along with the study guide that's a little more in-depth that I think you will find will help you study and prepare for the second exam. But before we get into that, I wanted to just run through kind of our overview of this week and what we need to be looking out for in our objectives. So as I mentioned, we're working on week 10. So this week we're specifically looking at what are high leverage practices and what are evidence-based practices. So not only are you going to be able to define what it is, but you're going to understand what that means, what it entails for you in the classroom. How do you use them? We're going to be talking about, do you use them interchangeably, and in what situations would you? What steps do you use when you're implementing these high leverage practices, evidence-based practices? You're actually going to get to watch a video to see how this looks. So if you're like me, I need to see this in action. So you're going to be able to get an understanding a little bit more in depth, getting to see what those are. I do have a Nearpod presentation. I'll check the link myself, so hopefully it still works. I know we've been having issues with the links, but it should be working. And if not, as always, please let me know. So let's go ahead and dive into what we're looking at this week. So we're going to be able to identify the categories of high leverage practices. So that's our objective. You are also going to be able to identify the difference between the two. For homework, how are you going to be assessed? So you're going to complete another IRIS module. This one is specifically about evidence-based practices. And I have a worksheet that will accompany that. So you can still do the assessment piece that's inside the IRIS module, which I always tell students that's a great way to gain feedback of your knowledge, to see kind of what you are comfortable with, what you understand, and maybe what you need a little bit more clarification on. The worksheet is what you will be turning in, and the worksheet goes directly along with the IRIS module. So you should be able to find the answers in the worksheet to the IRIS module, and that's what you will be completing. You also need to study for the quiz too, and we'll go over that as well. So those are ways you're going to be assessed. Okay. So the key words or concepts this week are really looking at, of course, evidence-based practices. Sometimes in the articles or in your reading, you may see EBP, which stands for evidence-based practices, which is what they're referring to. We're going to be looking a little bit at Every Student Succeeds Act, because this is how that act came up. This is how the evidence-based practices and high leverage practices came about, is through this law, this legislation act. and then, of course, high leverage practices. And what are those 4 aspects of high leverage practices? Collaboration, assessment, social emotional behavior, and instruction. Now, high leverage practices is really something that should be going along and that you may have been seeing inside of your co-teaching lesson plan. For instance, those strategies that you're using or that you chose, you get to choose one of the strategies that I gave you from the list. Those strategies are high leverage practices, right? Co-teaching is part of that high leverage practice. It's an evidence-based practice put into place. And within your plan, you're looking at collaboration with the students. Are they working together with the teacher? You're looking at how you're going to assess them. You're looking at their social emotional behavior, the instruction component. So all of those high leverage aspects of high leverage practices, you're going to be already seeing this in the co-teaching, which is evidence-based practices. So they go hand in hand. So those are the concepts and keywords really to look for and that you're going to be learning about this week. So jumping into week 10, the first thing I want to go over are the articles. So you have 2 articles to read instead of any textbook chapters, right? So the 2 articles that you're going to be reading are high leverage practices and evidence-based practices, a promising pair. So how these 2 work together. The second article is how do you successfully implement these evidence-based practices in a classroom. So I want to take a look. I'm not going to read the whole article or go over everything with you because I want you to do that on your own. But what I am going to do in each article, I really want to kind of point out some important things for you to look at and to pay attention to as you're reading this article. So on the article, High Leverage Practices and Evidence-Based Practices, a Promising Pair, it really talks about how these are powerful tools in a classroom. They can improve student outcomes. They help support students, right? They can help bridge that gap that you may see in the instruction part or in the education or learning of the students. So this article begins talking about what exactly is a high leverage practice and why are they important for you as an educator. So the article is coming from the aspect of, it's important for educators. They get a lot of bad rap sometimes. And they're realizing that there's such a huge gap in achievement for students, right, in the classroom. So because of that, they are trying to figure out ways that we can improve students, the outcomes of students, all students. But you'll see specifically this is also going to support those learners who have exceptionalities or disabilities. So we got to bridge that gap, and we have to make sure that we're using research-based practices, these evidence-based, that are going to really support those students. And it's really going to help and give you feedback, but also give the students feedback. Okay. So when we're talking about high leverage practices, we're going back to those 4 aspects that we look at: collaboration, assessment, social emotional behavior support, and instruction, right? So when we're specifically talking about collaboration, we're talking about not only the students working together in the classroom, right? We're looking at you as an educator. Who do you collaborate with? Do you collaborate with other teachers and professionals? Are you having effective meetings with the families and other educators or professionals to try to support that student? Are you collaborating with the student and the families to make sure that you're meeting those needs of that student and their learning? In assessment, we're talking about how you're going to use multiple ways to really understand what that student's strengths and needs are. So you're going to use that to help you develop a plan and to figure out which practice you should be doing or which part of the practice we should focus on. And what does that research practice look like for that student? You also have to have a way to use the data that you're gathering, right? When you assess the student, you got to use that to make sure you can improve those outcomes. So using that data to help you make a plan and implement is going to help you. And then look at who you should be talking to about the data you're gathering, right? This assessment. How are you going to use it? What does it tell you about that student? How should you communicate this with other colleagues or professionals, and also communicate with the parents about how this is going to help the student? Then we look at the social, emotional, behavioral support. So are you able to use this information, right, in your classroom, in the learning environment? How are you going to support that student? So we can't only look at the learning aspect. We have to look at those social emotional development of the student. We look at the behaviors. What kinds of practices are we putting in place to support them in this area of development? So are we teaching social behaviors? And when we're asking to look at the development of the child, a lot of times teachers automatically want to go to the child's age. But remember, if you're working with all learners, right, they're all unique. Some may have exceptionalities or disabilities or special needs. If this is the case, then you have to support them. And some of their goals might be a social emotional goal or a behavioral goal. So you have to make sure you're looking at the child's developmental level, their disability, and use those practices that are going to help them, right? So teaching those social behaviors and peer interactions, what's appropriate. If they're having a lot of behavioral issues, going back to what we just learned in week 7 and 8, are you conducting those functional behavior assessments so you can implement a behavior intervention plan to support them? Looking at your environment, we talk so much how the environment is really the third teacher. This cannot be more true. You really have to look at how you set your classroom up. Is it loud? Is it distracting? Is it move slowly? Is there room for students who maybe move about? So think about those who have special needs in your room or physical limitations. How is your room organized? Is it in a way that is consistent, organized, respectful, set up to the students can be successful? So we have to look at all the components of the classroom. Is it easy for them to gather their own materials? You know, you want it to flow where it makes sense and it's comfortable for everyone and everything is accessible. And this just makes it so much better in terms of classroom management. So you really need to think about your environment. And lastly, again, going back to that instructional support. I know this is where this derived from when we talk about closing the gaps and looking at inclusive classrooms and supporting all learners, even those with special needs. But we have to look at the instruction component, but we're looking specifically at each individual child's goals, right? So what are the short-term goals and long? Not only do we have to identify and prioritize them, but we have to have a system in place. So we have to design instruction toward those goals so we can meet them. And this is where those evidence-based research practices or these high leverage practices are going to help us do that. And then we have to really make sure that we're looking at the state standards, we're looking at the curriculum, where the child is developmentally. What specific learning goals are we trying to work with? And then how are we going to make sure we help them reach that? What materials are we going to use? What aspects of the curriculum can we use, or that we have to adapt new things and supplement to make sure that we support them? We have to provide scaffolding for them, put that support in place. And then also, we really need to foster independence, right? We don't need to develop a sense of learned helplessness with students who have exceptionalities or special needs. We have to make sure we teach those cognitive and metacognitive strategies. We have to support their learning, but we also want to support independence, so that's very important. Now, you can use high leverage practices, right? So if we're looking at both evidence-based and high leverage practices, we can use them together, right? So if we're looking specifically at a special education classroom and general education classroom, we're going to look at both, and we're going to be using both high leverage and evidence-based practices. So here's some examples of how we would use them together. You could have explicit instruction, flexible grouping. You can implement strategies that promote student engagement, like peer-to-peer interaction. Maybe you use those assistive technologies and instructional technologies. You pull them for intensive instruction, like maybe during RTI. You are making sure that students are able to access new learning across different time and settings. So what looks the same for some students may look different for the others. So this is something to keep in mind. And you have to keep in mind too about the time and settings. I think it's easy for us as educators when we get to where we have so many standards that we have to make sure we are checking off our list throughout the year, that we get so gung-ho on time. I've got to get this done. I don't have enough time. We can't have time to go back. But you have to look at the unique needs of your learners, right? So we may have different timeline, and that's okay. There's ways to meet several standards, right, without putting so much pressure on time. And then another thing is you always have to give feedback to students, right? Not only about their learning, but about their behavior as well. Okay, here's some commonalities which I like that tells you how these things work if we're talking about high leverage practices in special education and then in teaching regular education classrooms, right? So you're seeing here, there's a lot of common traits throughout. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but I want you to make sure that you pay attention to that so you can kind of see that there are commonalities here. But there's also some differences that you need to take note of. The second part of the article is really looking at evidence-based practices, like why are they important and what should you be doing. So when we're looking at evidence-based practices, they're important because these are research practices. They support both learning and behavior. This is important for you to realize that when we're talking about evidence-based practices, these are practices that have been implemented based on research and case studies. So I want you to go through that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that for the sake of time. But moving on to the second article, this article is really neat. What I do want you to notice about this article is looking at the steps of how you actually implement evidence-based practices, right, as an effective educator. So it really goes through and it models like what steps do you take. So step 1, determine student environment and instructor characteristics. Step 2, search sources of evidence-based practices. And then here's a really good table that kind of talks to you about the sources of evidence-based practices and what you need to do and things that you could use depending on what the disability is with the child. So that's very helpful. And there is really a really cool flow chart here that kind of walks you through the different steps. If you're a visual person, I think this flow chart really is going to help you. So make sure you look at the 10 steps. And then they even offer you a checklist so it can help keep you on track to make sure that you're doing all of these steps when you're implementing evidence-based practices. The next thing you'll look at, of course, is your Nearpod lesson. So when you click on the Nearpod lesson, you should be able to just click on it specifically, and it should pull up. I went ahead and fixed it, so it's just taking a minute to load. But it will come up, and then you should just be able to enter your name and walk through. And what I like about the Nearpod lessons is it's more interactive. So yeah, you'll just click your name and hit join a lesson. So you shouldn't have to do a join code on that. But it allows you some feedback, which I think you need, especially when you're talking about something you're not familiar with. The other thing I put here for you, if you, I do have a video here that I feel like is important for you to watch. So let me find it. Okay, so this video is very helpful, especially if you need to see how this is implemented in the classroom. What does this look like? So this video is really going to talk to you about what high leverage practices are, because it's like an introductory video, and it provides kind of like a roadmap. So it is going to allow you to see what this looks like, how we define it, and what you should be doing as an educator, especially when we're talking about working with students with disabilities. So you please watch this video. And then I provided you with a PowerPoint presentation here. This is just, it's a short PowerPoint. It's not very long. It's 9 slides. It just gives you some more information talking about how they use research and how this actually came about from the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and then the No Child Left Behind. So this is how this all got started. We're looking at these evidence-based and high leverage practices. And it talks about how you use the evidence from this research to be able to implement these practices. Now, for the assignments, if you scroll down, you're going to see you have an IRIS module. So what you're going to do is you're going to complete this IRIS module. Now, there is always assessment in here. I always tell students to do the assessment. But instead of turning in the assessment questions from the IRIS module, I actually have a note sheet, a worksheet, that you are going to complete, okay? And if you look here specifically, it tells you what page to find each of these answers from. And of course, in the IRIS module, there are video clips, so I may ask a question related to that video clip, so you may have to go back and watch that. And if you're not watching the video or audio clips inside of the IRIS modules, I highly recommend you do that because it is helpful to give you a deeper understanding about the content. And then, of course, we have our Quiz 2 study guide. So this is what's going to happen. And I'll talk more about this at the beginning of next week, but I wanted to give you a heads up. So our quiz will actually start Monday, November 6th and close November the 12th, which is a Sunday. So that'll give you a full week to take the test. You can take it whenever you feel comfortable. I did provide you with a really nice study guide here, okay, just like I did with the first test. So here's a study guide, but to go along with the study guide, I went ahead and did a PowerPoint review. So this is a review of things that I'm going to be asking you on the test, right? So this is going to cover weeks 6 through 10. It's quite long, but keep in mind, this is over 5 weeks of content. Okay, so this is like a review to accompany the study guide. So look at this, use the study guide, go back and pull out your notes. And I feel that if you do that, you will be successful. Now remember, on the test, you will have 2 attempts, and I'll take the highest grade average, just like we did from the first initial test. And there will be a mixture of questions, so I'll have some multiple choice, I will have some fill in the blank, maybe short answer or matching. So whenever you complete the test, remember that it will only grade the multiple choice portion. You do not get your final grade until I go in and grade the ones that you had to fill in or do short answer for or matching or any of that. So once I completely grade your test, I will email you. You should be then at that point to be able to go back in and look at all your answers to see kind of what you did well on and maybe what you had trouble with. So that is there for you. Also, one thing to note before I get off of here, because this video is pretty long, I wanted to remind you that your co-teaching lesson plan and presentation, your PowerPoint presentation, is due Sunday, November 5th. Okay, so just so you know, and are aware that it is due. I had a few people already submit it. One thing to know, if you're still working on it, that's fine. But remember, a co-teaching lesson plan, even though you're doing this alone, you still have to complete a part of a co-teacher. So that means that you have 2 parts inside your lesson plan, as if you were planning with another teacher. So you have to make that part up. So just keep that in mind. I sometimes have issues. I run into that. Go back and look at the video if you have questions in the assignment so you kind of understand what I'm wanting from you. But I hope this is a really great week of content. I'm excited for you to learn about high leverage practices. You've already been learning about them through your co-teaching plan and you didn't even realize it. Watch the video and please look at the quiz review and the PowerPoint review that I did for you for the study guide of quiz 2, because I really feel like it's going to help you on the test. And as always, guys, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. I'm always here to help you. I can meet in person, I can meet over the phone or Teams. I'm here to support you because I know this is a lot. This is a lot of content, and this is a heavy subject. matter to be doing online. So you don't have that same support that you would in person, but I am here if you need anything. All right, guys, until next time, take care.